Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Billi FitzSimons.
I'm Sam Koslowski and this is Cubby.
Cubby, our very special office dog.
He's a beautiful, kind-natured golden retriever.
The first time he's been allowed in the pod studio, and it will be very clear why. Did you know that rules of pet ownership are changing in Australia? Well, kind of. At the start of this month, the ACT revealed a new draft code of practice that sets out mandatory rules of dog ownership in the territory. Among the new rules is a required minimum time of 3 hours spent with a dog every day. Now, that is just for the ACT, but it comes a month after new laws at the federal level came into effect that changed how pets are seen in the family law system. It means pets won't just be seen as property, and there will be new special considerations to who took the best care of the pet. Today, we're looking at how the rules of pet ownership are changing.
Billi, this is such an interesting topic. I needed to make sure that Cubby was here to hear it because it might impact him. Oh, no. Yeah, no, he's good.
He was about to... Oh, I think he's moving. That's okay. He can stay here.
Billi, this is such an interesting topic. I wanted Cubby in the room. He's just taken a little walk from my lap, but that's okay. It's his right to do so. And This really is a story about the changing rights of dogs across Australia. It's such a cool thing to talk about. I'd never really thought about pet ownership as something that's overly regulated.
Yes.
I remember we did a podcast about the rights of renters to have pets in rental properties, but that was again from the aspect of
Humans.
the human rather than the pet. I'm really keen to get into this. First, how popular is pet ownership in Australia?
Sam, a quick bit of trivia for you. What percentage of households in Australia do you think has a pet? So any kind of pet.
I'm going to go with like 65%.
That's pretty bang on.
Wow.
It's about 70%.
And just think about that. So if you got 10 average Aussie households in a room, 7 out of 10 have a pet in the home.
Yes. And of those that do have a pet, 50% have a dog. So I'm sure it's no surprise that dogs are the most popular pet in Australia. Quick question. Are we allowed to talk about our own dogs here?
Yeah, a big shout out to Honey and Maggie, our family dogs. Honey's mine, Maggie is your family dog.
We
Both
love them.
beautiful dogs in their later years of life, but still very special. Why don't we start with the news out of the ACT, which is the most recent development in this space?
Yes, so at the start of this month, the ACT government released its draft of a code of practice for dog welfare.
Right.
Now, that was advised on by the ACT Animal Welfare Advisory Committee.
And when you're saying a code of practice, what exactly does that mean? And also, what legal weight does that have?
Yeah, so codes of practice provide safety and standards information to specific different tasks that people have. Now, this code specifically outlines mandatory standards that individuals responsible for dogs must meet.
Right.
It does say that kind of the rules of animal welfare are quite universally recognizable, but this is just quite specific to dogs.
Cool.
Also, a side note, the ACT is actually somewhat of a leader in this space because in 2019, the ACT government became the only jurisdiction in Australia that recognises animals as sentient beings that have intrinsic value and deserve to be treated with compassion.
That's so interesting from a legal standpoint. And so at this stage, there's this code of practice that they are proposing, and now they're actually seeking public feedback on it. What exactly is in the draft?
Okay, so I'll go through the changes. The first is that it provides an updated animal framework that, as well as recognising that dogs are sentient beings, it also recognises that animals have intrinsic value and deserve to be treated with compassion and have a quality of life that reflects their intrinsic value. And it also recognises that people have a duty to care for the physical and mental welfare of animals.
So there is kind of existing animal cruelty rules, and we hear of cases, terrible cases all the time of dogs being locked in cars or mistreatment. There was a massive, news event with investigations into the greyhound racing industry, for example, a couple of years ago. But I think what's different about this draft is that mental component, perhaps, and really trying to ensure the mental health and emotional health of the dog is so interesting.
Yeah. And I think it's about recognizing that animals are these beings on their own that don't just exist in relation to humans. Like it's not kind of, I know that for a lot of people, dogs can kind of help you, but this is about recognizing how you can help dogs.
Yeah. It is interesting that they've specified dogs
Yes.
and that it doesn't expand to other animals.
Yeah.
Okay, so how are they actually going about quantifying or somewhat validating the idea that you're emotionally and physically caring for your dog?
Yeah, so this is the one that caught my attention. So the ACT government in this code of practice is saying that they want to expand guidelines for dog owners and carers that would require all dogs to have a minimum of 3 hours of human contact daily.
That is really interesting.
So interesting.
I think it must be trying to kind of eradicate people who leave their dogs alone for hours and hours and days at a time, right?
Yeah. Now you might be asking why? What's their reasoning behind this?
Yeah.
And so the draft code kind of explains that. Now I'm going to read out, it's a bit of a lengthy quote, but I think it's really interesting. So it says, undesirable behaviours in dogs, such as excessive barking, can result from leaving them unattended for extended periods, leading to boredom and anxiety. And that kind of speaks to that mental health well-being that we were talking about. It continues, as well as indicating distress, these behaviours can lead to animal nuisance and neighbourhood complaints.
So bad PR for dogs.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. And so because of this, it is saying that it should be mandatory for dogs to spend at least 3 hours a day with human contact.
So what I'm reading into that is this isn't about just being with the dog when you're asleep and the dog is asleep.
No.
This is about more meaningful time spent with your pet.
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video.
Yes. And interestingly, it also recommends, so it doesn't make this mandatory, but it recommends that dogs live inside. So it says dogs are social pack animals and are likely to be happiest living in the house with their human family and other dogs. Dogs are also more useful as intruder deterrents if they live inside the house.
I feel like that's somewhat stating the obvious.
Yes.
You know, dogs are happier when they're around people and they might scare off someone who's not meant to be there. That's something that's very well established. I guess by applying it into this framework, what they're trying to do is give owners some guidelines of best practice, which is a different way to approach pet ownership as we've seen in Australia.
Wait, you know who does get their 3 hours in, definitely?
Who?
Cubby.
Cubby. So Cubby is not a TDA dog. Cubby
No.
is a dog of the other business that we share with. And man, does that office light up when Cubby walks in. I mean,
Cubby's in most days.
he's in most days. He's a very good boy.
Yes.
Has particular love for the news, it would seem. I've wanted to actually get a dog for TDA
I
for a
would
long
love
time
that.
and call it newspaper.
Oh.
And, but, you know, it hasn't happened yet because of, interestingly, some of the things that you're raising here, which is me and my wife. We both work very long days out of the house. And so unless some dog was with me at work, it would be spending probably not the 3 hours a day of mandatory human contact.
Yeah, it's an important thing to think about.
And did the code expand not just in the quality time love language, but other parts of a dog's life?
Yeah, it really went through kind of all parts of a dog's life. If I say retractable leads, do you know what I'm talking about?
Tape measurers.
Oh my God, I've never thought of them like that. But yes, kind of like that, which I have always thought they were quite common and I never knew that there was anything wrong with them. But the ACT's draft code of practice says that a person in charge of a dog should not use retractable leashes because they could result in injury. And they expanded on that. So they said a retractable leash limits control, poses risk, and could be dangerous to both the dog and the walker. And they said that retractable leashes are only suitable for well-trained dogs. So they're not completely banning retractable leashes, but they're just saying that they should only be used in specific circumstances.
One part of it which really interested me was the part of the code that restricted surgical debarking.
Yeah. Have you heard of that before?
I haven't actually
No.
heard of that. I know I can picture a muzzle in my head
Yeah.
and dogs that are restricted by some sort of physical barrier to barking, but I hadn't heard of surgical debarking.
Yeah, and so it's saying that surgical debarking procedures must not be considered as a bark reduction strategy if the dog is under 12 months of age. And it also says that it should only ever be considered if the dog is considered a public nuisance. Now, you might be wondering, how do you prove if your dog is a public nuisance? And it had a very specific kind of guideline or criteria. It said that you have to have at least 2 written complaints from your neighbour to say that your dog is kind of officially a public nuisance, and only then could it be considered that your dog might need surgical debarking.
So this is a really long report. Those are some of the categories that are covered there. This is a 50-page code. Like there's kind of every aspect of the dog's life is covered. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. But you've also said, and I think this is the bit that I'm struggling with this story, is what's binding, what's part of the law, what can be enforced. Draft code always makes alarm bells go off for me of, can this actually be enforced? And, you know, what actual strength does it give the ACT government in improving the lives of dogs in the territory?
I think the thing to think about is, for all things like this, you know, there are so many different examples where the government has guidelines for, I guess, how we should live our life.
Yeah.
Things like alcohol consumption, cigarette consumption. And you're right, it is really hard to enforce. And this isn't the kind of thing where police are now going to be doing random checks on people's houses.
Retractable leashes.
Yes, to start seeing whether or not you are spending your compulsory 3 hours a day with your dog.
Yeah.
But it's meant to be more of a guideline.
Right.
And I would say only in extreme circumstances, if they believe that there is animal cruelty going on or
which is a crime. Like that's indisputably a crime. Yeah.
So if there's like systemic neglect there that, you know, I imagine someone would have to report you for, then that's when this would be enforced.
Right.
But again, I think there are lots of different examples where they kind of give you a guideline.
Yeah. Well, the media has guidelines on how we report stories. That would be a good example.
Yes.
But then there are actual laws, as we've just mentioned, and one area that's changed a lot is pet ownership and how it's viewed in the family law context.
Yes. So this came in June, and so it was a new law that came into effect that meant that pets are no longer considered as property during family court settlements in Australia.
Right.
So this is talking about something like a divorce, and if a couple is deciding who gets what in that separation, traditionally dogs have been considered property, kind of like this financial thing that needs to be, I guess, divided during that separation. Now, these new rules mean that the family court system will be required to expand how it views pets, and it will be mandatory for the family court to actually take into account the extent to which each party, so each person in that relationship, cared for the animal, as well as any history of cruelty to the pet by a party. In terms of, you know, kind of the extent to which each person cared for the pet, it basically means that the family court will be taking into account things like who fed the pet or who walked the pet.
Wow.
Interesting things like that now are literally part of the law.
And that's a really interesting example of how a process that was probably started with some sort of code, with some sort of guideline framework of here's how you should be thinking about who owns a pet after a divorce, actually could sometimes become law and become a really codified part of the system. Billi, that is so interesting to see the changing roles of pets in Australia. You're going to have to go home and tell Maggie absolutely everything, because she's going to be thrilled with these newfound strengths of hers in Australia.
I'm glad that you're allowing us to talk about Maggie more, because for all those listening, Sam has stopped me from talking about Maggie.
I just know...
Apparently it's too self-indulgent.
Well, I just know that everyone listening right now, all they want to do is talk about their pet to us, and that's their right.
Do you think it's like dreams? Like you're always interested in your dreams, but no one else is interested in your dreams?
I think so. And that's why I think Cubby left, because you started talking about Maggie and Cubby had enough.
Well, just know, Sam, that I'll always be here to talk about honey.
That's very sweet. That's very sweet, just like honey. And that's all we've got time for of a very strange episode of the Daily Aus for you. But I hope that brought a bit of joy to your Friday. We're going to be back in the afternoon with some headlines. Until then, have a fantastic start to the day. Say hi to your dog for me, and we'll chat later.
Bye.